All right, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to be doing something a little bit different. We are stepping way back from the daily news cycle, looking past all the modern political talking points, and really examining the foundational architecture of a self-governing republic. We're taking a deep dive into the true nature of what it actually means to cast a ballot. And it really all centers around one profound, kind of controversial question. Should voting require deliberate effort? You see, there's this fascinating philosophical perspective arguing that a stable, enduring democracy actually cannot survive on raw numbers alone. Instead of just focusing on, maximizing voter turnout by any means necessary, this framework suggests that a thriving republic requires a very specific caliber of citizenship, one that's grounded in intentionality and deliberate effort. To unpack this, we're going to break the source material down into 5 key pillars: the intentional voting model, the principle of informed consent, authority versus responsibility, resisting mass manipulation, and finally, the classical roots of voting. Okay, let's jump right into part 1, the intentional voting model. At its core, the concept of intentional civic engagement is built on the premise that sheer volume just isn't what sustains a democracy. It's really about caliber. The argument here is that pushing for maximum participation without requiring any deliberate effort from the voter fundamentally misunderstands how a self-governing republic actually stays stable over the long haul. Moving right along to part 2, the principle of informed consent. The source text draws this really stark contrast between passive voting and active governance. Think about it. Passive voting is described as being akin to getting a junk mail catalog, mindlessly checking a box, and just tossing it back in the mail. If a voter doesn't actually know the candidates or the policies or the long-term fiscal consequences of a ballot initiative, well, that's not governance at all, right? It's just a random guess or maybe an emotional reaction to a really slick ad campaign. So to counter that passivity, this framework suggests there needs to be a baseline of effort. By requiring sequential, intentional actions, like, say, registering ahead of time, actively requesting a ballot with intent, or actually taking the time to travel to a polling place, the entire dynamic of the election changes. And here's why that matters. This built-in friction acts as a natural, self-selected filter. It ensures that the people who are ultimately shaping the laws of the land have invested at least a minimum amount of thought and effort into the outcome. It elevates deliberate thought way above casual participation. Which brings us to part 3, authority versus responsibility. This is absolutely crucial. When you make voting entirely passive, you end up separating authority from responsibility. The inherent danger here is that zero-effort voting heavily favors short-term, feel-good promises over massive long-term costs, things like national debt or structural economic damage. The necessary counterweight? Intentionality. It grounds people. It reminds voters that casting a ballot literally means exercising tangible authority over their neighbors, their community, and future generations. All right, part 4, resisting mass manipulation. So what happens when the barrier to entry totally vanishes? Well, the argument is that an unengaged electorate becomes highly susceptible to emotional manipulation. Elections stop being meaningful debates over competing ideas. Instead, they just evolve into sheer spending contests. We're talking races to fund massive ballot harvesting operations, blasting aggressive text message campaigns, and relying on total media saturation simply to activate people who are otherwise completely indifferent. Ultimately, without intentionality, the system's focus entirely shifts. It goes from persuading minds to simply collecting paper. It's a pretty striking concept, honestly. The fear is that passive voting systems risk treating ballots as a harvestable commodity rather than a genuine engagement of human intellect. And finally, part 5, the classical roots of voting. Now, you might be thinking, this is a modern debate, but it's really not. Today, for sure, we often hear voting framed as a modern consumer right, like it should be as frictionless as online shopping. Add to cart, click, done. But classical Athenian and Roman thought viewed the ballot entirely differently. They saw it as a weighty office of public trust. Aristotle actually hit the nail on the head here when he noted, a citizen is someone who shares in the administration of justice and in the holding of office. This completely elevates the debate. He's basically saying that citizenship isn't just some passive right, it's an active duty. It's a literal sharing of administrative and judicial burdens. So if we step back and map out this entire framework, 3 core elements really emerge. First, the ballot is a tool. It's an instrument of precise, calculated judgment used to carefully steer the state. Second, friction. Things like deadlines or active registration aren't seen as negative barriers, but rather as a crucible ensuring only those with a genuine stake and interest are participating. And third, the ultimate goal, preserving the stability, institutional wisdom, and long-term health of the republic by prioritizing the substance of the electorate's choices over just sheer volume. The conclusion from this classical viewpoint is incredibly firm. Treating the vote as a cheap, thoughtless commodity doesn't expand democracy, it degrades it. True civic virtue requires a citizen to stand up, pay attention, and consciously step into the arena. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought based on everything we've just covered. When you cast your next vote, how do you view your own ballot? Are you simply participating in the collection of paper, or are you exercising a weighty office of public trust? Thanks so much for joining me today as we explored the philosophy of intentional voting. Catch you next time.